It started off as a typical Wednesday morning. The kind where everything feels routine and predictable. I was making my usual cup of coffee, listening to the low hum of the morning news, while my husband, Matt, was getting ready for work. It wasn't until I caught a glimpse of him in the hallway that I noticed something was off. There was a subtle redness around his mouth. Tiny, almost invisible blisters forming at the edges of his lips. He rubbed at his hands absent-mindedly, the way you do when something itches but you're trying not to scratch. He was moving slower than usual. And when he finally spoke, his voice sounded different. Scratchy. As if he'd been trying to clear his throat all morning. Are you feeling okay? I asked, already knowing the answer. I had been through this routine before with our 2 young kids. I had seen these symptoms before. The telltale signs of hand, foot, and mouth disease. My stomach twisted at the thought. He brushed off my concern, mumbling something about allergies or a mild cold. But I knew better. The rash on his hands was becoming more noticeable, and the fatigue in his eyes was unmistakable. I stood there, holding my coffee, silently weighing what to do next. Hand, foot, and mouth disease is one of those things that you expect to encounter when you have kids. It had swept through our household twice before, both times leaving everyone feeling miserable and exhausted. It's common, especially in young children. But for adults, it's much more rare, and much more uncomfortable. The last time Matt had caught it had knocked him out for a solid week. And I had been the one left caring for him and the kids while juggling my own work. It was a nightmare I didn't want to repeat. As I watched him move through the kitchen, rubbing his hands, my anxiety grew. I wasn't mad at him for being sick. I knew it wasn't his fault. But I also couldn't help the growing discomfort in my gut. We shared everything in our life, our home, our responsibilities, our bed. But this was one thing I wasn't ready to share. I knew what was coming. The blisters would spread. The fever would follow. He would feel weak, achy, and irritable. And through it all, I would have to be the one to hold everything together. The kids would still need to be fed. The house would still need to be cleaned. And work would still demand my attention. I didn't have time to be sick. I didn't have the luxury of getting taken down by something like hand, foot, and mouth. So, when he came over to give me his usual morning kiss before heading out the door, I did something I had never done before. I turned my head away. His face registered confusion, maybe even a hint of hurt. But I didn't back down. I think you're getting sick, I said, my voice firm but calm. And I really don't want to catch whatever it is. He laughed it off, claiming it was nothing serious. But I stood my ground. I had seen enough to know where this was headed. Just to be safe, I added, trying to sound reasonable, though I could feel my own frustration building. It's probably best if we don't kiss until we're sure. He didn't argue, but the moment hung in the air like an invisible weight between us. I could see the unspoken questions in his eyes. Did I think he was contagious? Was I overreacting? Did I really not want to kiss him? The truth was, I felt torn. On one hand, I loved my husband deeply, and the thought of pulling away from him, especially when he was on the verge of feeling miserable, hurt. But on the other hand, I had to protect myself. I couldn't afford to be laid up with a viral infection, especially one as relentless as this. I had responsibilities, and the fear of being incapacitated loomed larger than my guilt. As the day went on, that brief moment of turning my head away replayed in my mind. I questioned whether I had overreacted, whether I had made a bigger deal out of it than necessary. But every time I thought about those tiny blisters on his lips and the rash forming on his hands, my resolve solidified. I had every right to protect myself from getting sick. Didn't I? But it wasn't just about the physical sickness. There was something else. Something deeper that bothered me. It was the fear of what this infection represented. The loss of control. The helplessness that comes with being sick. I had always prided myself on being able to handle whatever life threw my way. But the truth was, I hated feeling vulnerable. And getting sick meant being vulnerable in ways I wasn't comfortable with. By the time Matt came home that evening, the signs were even more apparent. He looked exhausted. His skin flushed, and the rash on his hands had spread. He tried to shrug it off again, but I could see the discomfort in his movements. I made him sit down and take his temperature. Sure enough, he was running a low-grade fever. I kept my distance, offering him some Tylenol and a glass of water. But I didn't get too close. I could see the confusion in his eyes again, but he didn't push it. We went through our usual evening routine. Dinner, putting the kids to bed. But the air between us felt different. There was an unspoken tension that hadn't been there before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow crossed a line by pulling away from him. Over the next few days, Matt's symptoms worsened. He developed more blisters on his feet and mouth, and his fever spiked. I did my best to take care of him while keeping my distance, but it wasn't easy. I felt guilty for holding him at arm's length, but I also knew I had to protect myself and the kids. Every time he reached for me, whether for comfort or just out of habit, I hesitated. I knew he needed me, but I couldn't bring myself to risk getting infected. The thought of being taken down by this virus, of not being able to care for the kids, of falling behind at work, it terrified me. So, I kept my distance. And with every moment of hesitation, the guilt grew. I wondered if I was being unfair. Was I supposed to put his needs above my own health? Was I selfish for asking him not to kiss me? For creating this invisible barrier between us? The more I thought about it, the more conflicted I felt. On the one hand, I had every right to protect myself from getting sick. On the other hand, I knew that my refusal to kiss him, to offer the comfort he sought, was causing a rift between us. There were moments when I could see the frustration in his eyes. Moments when he seemed distant, emotionally as well as physically. I didn't blame him. It's hard not to feel rejected when the person you love pulls away, even if the reason is understandable. But I couldn't help it. The fear of getting sick, of losing control over my own health, was too great. The days stretched into a week, and though Matt's symptoms eventually started to improve, the tension between us lingered. We went through the motions of our daily lives, but there was an undeniable distance between us, one that hadn't existed before. It was as if my decision to pull away from him had created a crack in our relationship, one that neither of us knew how to repair. I replayed the moment I had turned my head in my mind, wondering if I had made the right choice. Was it wrong of me to prioritize my own health over his need for comfort? Should I have been more understanding, more willing to offer the support he needed, even if it meant risking my own well-being? The questions haunted me, leaving me with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. In the end, I knew I had made the decision that felt right for me in the moment. But that didn't mean it was easy. I cared deeply for Matt, but I also knew that I had to take care of myself. The balance between self-care and supporting a partner isn't always clear. And sometimes, the lines get blurred. I wasn't sure if I had done the right thing, but I knew that I had acted out of a need to protect myself from something I couldn't control. As Matt's health returned to normal, life slowly began to fall back into its usual rhythm. But the experience left me with lingering doubts. Not just about the decision I had made, but about the nature of relationships and the delicate balance between caring for yourself and caring for someone else. Was I wrong for asking my husband not to kiss me when he was showing signs of hand, foot, and mouth? I still don't have a clear answer. But what I do know is that sometimes, in the face of uncertainty, we have to make choices that may not feel perfect, but that allow us to protect ourselves and the people we love, even if those choices come with their own set of complications. As Matt's health improved, things slowly started to return to normal. But there was a lingering tension between us that I couldn't ignore. The distance that had formed during those days of sickness didn't simply vanish when the symptoms did. It was subtle, but noticeable, a slight hesitation in his touch, a pause before he spoke to me, a shift in the way we navigated our shared space. It was as if my decision to pull away from him had planted a seed of doubt, not just in him, but in me as well. I found myself reflecting on it constantly. Was it worth it? Was the temporary relief of not getting sick worth the emotional wedge that had crept between us? I replayed the moment I turned my head over and over again, analyzing it from every angle. In my mind, I was justified. I had made a choice to protect myself, to ensure I could continue caring for the kids and keeping our household running smoothly. But at what cost? It wasn't that Matt held it against me. At least, not openly. He never mentioned it again. And as the days passed, things gradually smoothed over. We returned to our usual routines. But there was an underlying fragility to our interactions that hadn't been there before. It wasn't something you could see, but I could feel it in the way he hesitated before kissing me again, even after he was fully recovered. It was as if that small moment of rejection had left a crack in the foundation of our relationship, one that neither of us knew how to fully repair. I wrestled with that guilt for weeks, torn between my desire to protect myself and my fear that I had done real damage to the trust and intimacy between us. There's something deeply unsettling about knowing that a single moment of hesitation, however well-intentioned, can have such lasting consequences. Eventually, I knew I had to confront the emotions that had been swirling inside me. One evening, after the kids were in bed and the house was finally quiet, I sat down by myself and let everything surface. The anxiety, the guilt, the uncertainty. It all came rushing in. I realized that my decision had been more than just about avoiding illness, it was about control. Control over my own vulnerability, my own fear of being incapacitated, and, ultimately, my fear of not being able to handle things if I were the one who got sick. I had been so focused on protecting myself that I hadn't stopped to consider what my actions might be saying to Matt. That I didn't trust him to manage things if I went down. Or worse, that I didn't want to be near him when he was at his most vulnerable. It was never my intention to make him feel rejected. But intentions don't always match the impact. The truth was, I had to accept that in a marriage, there will always be moments where you have to balance your own needs with the needs of your partner. And sometimes, you'll get it wrong. Sometimes, you'll make decisions that seem right in the moment but end up leaving a mark. It's part of the messy, complicated reality of being in a long-term relationship. In the end, I had to forgive myself for making a difficult choice. And I had to trust that Matt would, too. We were both learning how to navigate life together, with all its unpredictability and challenges. And while there would always be bumps along the way, what mattered most was that we were committed to working through them, even when the answers weren't clear. So, as I lay next to him that night, feeling the warmth of his presence beside me, I reached out and took his hand. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like the beginning of a bridge between us. A small step toward healing the distance that had grown during those long days of sickness. He squeezed my hand back. And in that moment, I knew that while things weren't perfect, we would be okay. We were stronger than a moment of hesitation. Stronger than the fear that had kept us apart. We were in this together. For better or worse. In sickness and in health. And no matter what challenges came our way, we would find a way through. Together.